and start the presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this, which is our 16th regional plan snapshot. This particular one is going to focus today on vegetation and wildlife and the ecosystems of our region. And for this special Valentine's Day presentation, we have Jessica Simmons, who is from Coconino County, and Hannah Griscom from the Arizona Department of Game and Fish to tell us about an overview of what it is we have in the region for natural resources that are part of our planning horizon in the regional plan. I remind everyone that these snapshots happen almost every Monday. We're going to skip President's Day next weekend, and the next one will be February 28th. And that all of them can be found at flagstaff.az.gov/regional plan 2045. These are made of 15-minute presentations and 15 minutes for Q&A. And everything in all of these presentations is just a draft, a chance to share what we know right now. And part of the regional plan process is learning more and getting curious. And so with that, I am going to pass the torch to Jessica.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, so the first slide here, I just have the Flagstaff Regional Planning Area just to orient everybody and remind everybody the geographic area we're talking about. So next slide. So right here, we're showing wildlife corridors. This map shows wildlife linkage zones in the planning area. These are those green striped polygons we're looking at. These are areas that were identified in a multi-agency effort in 2011. Animals use these areas to travel between patches of intact habitat, and this is necessary for them to be able to find food and mates at different times a year. And it's also so populations can intermix and they don't become genetically isolated. So this is really important for necessary life processes for wildlife. Each of these separate polygons, each linkage zone, is described in a report that came along with this effort. And if you look in the report, each zone is described as far as which species use it and the potential threats to each linkage as far as maintaining the continuity of it. This is useful when developments are proposed within any of these areas so that the project can be analyzed and designed in such a way so as to maintain passage for those particular species that use each linkage zone. Next slide. So Ponderosa pine forest ecology is a very important aspect of ecosystem management in the Flagstaff area. Flagstaff is in the wildlife-urban interface, so it's completely surrounded by Ponderosa pine forest that, due to historic fire suppression, poses an increasing risk of severe wildfire, and I'm sure everyone can think of recent examples of that. To address this, over the past couple decades, the Forest Service, the City of Flagstaff, and Coconino County have engaged in efforts to lessen the risk of a severe wildfire near Flagstaff by conducting thinning and burning operations. These operations mimic the effects of the frequent low-intensity fires that this area is adapted to. These treatments not only decrease the risk to life and property from fire, but it keeps the forest healthy so that wildlife have proper habitat, and it protects watersheds, maintaining water quantity and quality. Ponderosa forests can take decades or even centuries to recover from a severe wildfire, so it's really important to be performing these thinning and burning operations now on as much acreage as possible within the planning area and elsewhere, of course, and especially because climate change is only going to exacerbate this trend. Next slide.
So springs, wetlands, and floodplains are important habitats for wildlife in the Flagstaff planning area and beyond. Springs and riparian habitats such as this one, which is Hawksworth Spring on Coconino National Forest, are really biodiversity hotspots for both plants and animals, insects, a whole array of different species. And studies have found that 85% of the wildlife across Arizona depends on a riparian source of habitat at least one point in their life cycle. Even though these habitats only cover about 1% of the landscape, they're disproportionately important for wildlife. And because of that, and because of the services they provide to our watershed and our recreational values, we we try to protect these areas within the planning zone for future generations. Next slide. So the topic of roads is important when it comes to wildlife. Roads obviously provide a real barrier to wildlife movement, and they can certainly kill wildlife. And sometimes when vehicles collide with larger wildlife, people can also get hurt. So thinking about wildlife movement and roads is important for everybody. And this is a slide that shows a study that the Arizona Game and Fish Department did for the Department of Transportation, looking at where wildlife fatalities were most common along sections of I-40 in the Flagstaff area. The red sections, the red and orange areas are where we tend to see the most number of wildlife being killed on the freeway. And the little X's that you see are either places where a wildlife overpass could be put, or where there's currently a bridge or an underpass under the freeway. So the combination of fencing and providing overpasses for wildlife can really mitigate the impacts of roads to both wildlife and humans. And so when we think about planning for expansion, we think a lot about fences and roads and how to sort of manage wildlife with those two tools. Next slide, please.
Weeds. Nobody likes weeds. Besides the ones we pull out of our gardens, introduced invasive plants in the wild environment are harmful because they can choke out native plants, including sensitive and special status species, and they can just form a complete monoculture if they're left to do their own business. This reduces the amount of forage available for wildlife, and it can reduce the amount of water available. And having these other plant species around just disrupts the native natural processes that a particular ecosystem has evolved with. Here are some common ones in the planning area that you can see on the slide. There are efforts underway to manage these weeds by the Forest Service, the City of Flagstaff, and Coconino County. Depending on the weed species, there are different ways to manage them. If you're talking about a small area, it can be possible to eradicate them, but in a lot of cases, the goal is just to stop the spread. Especially in disturbed areas, there's just always new seeds coming in from humans or animals or the wind. Next slide. So special status plants and animals. A special status means that a plant or animal species has been given a status by a federal or state agency, usually due to populations that are declining or possibly just because they're naturally rare. Most well-known status is threatened or endangered. We've all heard of that. Here on this slide, we have the threatened Mexican spotted owl and the threatened San Francisco Peaks ragwort. It's a little plant that grows up on the top of the peaks. In Arizona, there's a state status called Species of Greatest Conservation Need. And here's the Gunnison's prairie dog here, which has that status. And the other plant I'm showing here is the clustered leather flower, a clematis, which is designated sensitive by the Forest Service and also highly safeguarded under the Arizona Native Plant Law, which means you can't pick it. And knowing which special status species occur in certain areas is important so that if a potential development could negatively impact one of these species, considerations and special protections can be enacted on a case-by-case basis. These animals I'm showing here and talking about and plants is not an exhaustive list of special status species in the planning area. However, as far as animals go, the spotted owl and the prairie dog are the two special status species we most often see being potentially impacted by human activity. The spotted owl has critical habitat in the planning area in areas of old growth ponderosa pine and mixed conifer, like up on the San Francisco Peaks, for example. And Gunnison's prairie dogs are often present in urban areas, and sometimes if a development is going to be right on top of an active colony, if certain criteria are met, we're able to translocate those animals to wild areas away from people where they can serve their natural ecosystem functions, of which there are many because they are a keystone species. Next slide. So impacts on wildlife from development. Their habitat can be destroyed, their movement corridors can be blocked, there can be mortality, for example, from vehicle collisions. There can be light and noise disturbance. This is an important thing, which I haven't touched on yet. Flagstaff, we care about our dark skies here, and light pollution can negatively impact wildlife in many ways, from large animals to insects. Their resources can be disrupted, for example, prey populations, and there can be loss of water quantity and quality. Next slide. So what are some ways we can protect wildlife from these impacts? We can preserve and enhance habitat, especially those linkage zones I talked about earlier. We can protect known locations of special status plants. We can protect important habitat features. For example, here's a photo of a large diameter Ponderosa pine, so old growth trees, steep slopes, ridge lines, that kind of thing. We can protect known bird nests. We can prevent and control weeds. And then these last three we have in bold because we're going to discuss them a little bit more. We can funnel wildlife to safe road crossings. There's low impact development and wildlife friendly fencing. Next slide.
So this is a slide that's sort of showing how we can get out in front of development for proactive wildlife planning. The green dots that you see on the left are locations of elk that were GPS collared in the Flagstaff area, and that concentration of dots is along the Rio de Flag. The maroon dots are kind of the movement paths that they took between those dots. And then the yellow line is a proposed road that hasn't been built yet. And so we can use data like this to create the map on the right-hand side, which is the frequency that elk are using in different areas of that road, proposed road area, to move back and forth through this area. And so we're using data that we've collected from wildlife movements to help inform where the best places would be to put an underpass for wildlife so that they can continue to move through. And we can also combine this with funnel fencing that essentially encourages and forces, in some cases, wildlife to use these underpasses. And over several generations, they will actually learn very effectively how to use them. So it's just an example of how we can proactively plan. Next slide, please.
I'm muted. So as far as fencing, this diagram shows how your typical barbed wire fencing can be constructed to allow large animals to pass. The features that are encompassed in this diagram are it's short enough to allow animals to jump over. It has a gap underneath to allow smaller animals and pronghorn to pass under, as well as babies who are following their mothers. And it keeps also the gaps in there keep the animal's legs from becoming entangled when they try to jump over. And sometimes, of course, you do want to exclude wildlife, either because of the land use or to keep them out of dangerous areas such as roads, like Hannah was talking about. But this is in places where you do want to allow wildlife passage. And the county has required some developers, such as low density subdivisions, to make fencing wildlife friendly as part of their development. Next slide. Low impact development is a way to manage stormwater. So instead of stormwater entering a storm drain and a cement culvert and being delivered straight into a stream or lake, low impact development allows water to filter in through the soil. And this slows down storm runoff, which reduces erosion. It recharges aquifers, and it filters out pollutants that would otherwise just go straight into streams. And this is something that's being implemented in both the city and the county and is in the comprehensive plan. And the next few slides are just a couple examples of this. So next slide, real quick. This is an alternative to a cement culvert. Next slide. And here's another settling pond. Next slide. Not a settling pond, but a. And then these are alternatives to impervious surfaces such as driveways or sidewalks, which allow water to go through. Next.
So this is our final slide, and it, we're thinking about the future here and sort of the biggest issues that might come to pass in terms of wildlife and natural resources in the planning area. And I think, as we thought through this, climate change is certainly the biggest one. And so some of the things we can probably expect to see and should be thinking about are increased risk of wildfire, extreme temperatures, more flooding, certainly decreased water on the surface and its availability to wildlife. And this makes linkages for wildlife more important as those sources of water start to dry up. And then, of course, we're also seeing range shifts for some of our wildlife. They're actually moving up in elevation, and we can expect to see some of that with plants as well. So, for example, javelina have increased quite a bit above the Mogollon Rim in the last 10 to 15 years. So there's lots of ways we as planners and residents can sort of think proactively about how to help help animals and plants mitigate the impacts of climate change. And that's, I think, all we have in terms of the presentation, and we'd love to take any questions.
Oh, Nat's there too. I think Nat and I are the audience. Great.
Well, I think we've got 3 folks here, but yeah, if you, Scott, do you want to go ahead and ask a question?
We have mention of a conservation land system in the existing regional plan. Famously, we have a great one going on that shows the success and power of such a system in Pima County, and I hope that we examine that. It's a big step to take. It's difficult, but the last time I looked at the Pima County website, they had protected 180,000 acres down there, which is pretty impressive. My other comment is that here before us, we have some pretty amazing wildlife horsepower. And that is the general situation, I think, when we're dealing with questions of ecology. I think we have less coordination in the plant world, in the world of flora. And so at the Conservation Study Forum, we are working very slowly, my fault, on a city-county joint position for a plant ecologist who, I mean, we have great resources in the city and county dedicated to plants, but the coordination is not there the way it is when we see somebody from Game and Fish or our county wildlife planner. Those folks have decades of research and data, and we, at their fingertips, coordinated. We don't have anything like that in the plant world. And so those would be my 2, I guess, questions in the form of, can we make progress on these? And thanks.
I think you did a good job, Sad, of identifying one of the areas that's been hardest to make progress on in the last 10 years with the regional plan. Invasive plants in particular, but rare plants also have been an area where we've reached out and used our partnerships and, retired botanists in our community, maybe you know a few, who have offered some time and expertise to staff when available, but they're not always looking for new work. And so it has been a challenge. There's also, in environmental planning, there's always the charismatic megafauna like elk and, javelinas, and there's sometimes more funding for research and management of those than there are for our plant species. We've certainly made some progress where we have been able to. We've had a lot of discussions up front when there's been development, at least in the city, and maybe Melissa might be able to speak to the county when we think there's a high risk of invasive plants. The development around McMillan Mesa, it was part of our discussions during construction about not letting the invasive plant issues that already exist there get any worse or get spread by the construction practices up on the mesa. But those are all really voluntary compliance based on the expertise of the public and the park staff and those who've been helping us with that work. And so it is an area where there's lots of growth to do. in terms of the community. On the conservation lands system, we have not made progress on that, though we have a good understanding of our natural resources and our parks and open space, and their connectivity has been a heightened topic, both for our commissions and for staff. We haven't quite gotten to the level of getting a full land system that we really understand as a whole across all property boundaries. We've kind of made progress when we started working on the Flagstaff Trails Initiative, though, I would say, because that was one of the big risks to our natural lands and to their ability to provide habitat is unmanaged recreation. And so getting to the point of having a trails initiative that thinks about trails at that system level actually is an assist to our wildlife systems as well, because we start to think about how we're managing recreation on the landscape, not just on the Forest Service and the Park Service in the city, but on all of those across the region. So that was an area, even though it sounds like a recreation project, it was really about our natural systems as well. Hannah and Jessica, do you have anything to add on thoughts on either of those topics?
No, I definitely agree with you, Sarah, in your assessment of all of that. And I would just add that the conservation land system approach is a labor-intensive one, and it's potentially could yield a lot of fruit for the community. But if the county and city would like to move forward with it, there will have to be a really some deep thinking about resources for that, because we sort of went down that path a little bit in the last Coconino comprehensive plan and realized quickly that we didn't have the manpower and the resources to do it. So
the plans are where we put our aspirations. So I always tell people that too, we're aspiring. I think it's still something aspired to. It's just not something that's felt achievable yet. It'd be exciting to move in that direction.
I can tell you that in the county, interestingly, recently we've had not quite applications yet, but interest in huge solar arrays and solar electric arrays. And the Planning and Zoning Commission kind of spontaneously has gotten into the mindset of what are we doing here? You know, what is the impact of this? You know, we tend to look at things as individual projects, but these are multiple, 10 square miles at a time, some of them, and probably more to come. So there is some enthusiasm, I think, and some a good learning curve happening among county, P&Z, and staff. I think kind of in the direction of big picture, and we were excited to get the maps of wildlife movement and wildlife corridors, because we could kind of that's a tool that we can use in planning and zoning to make sure that I mean we've got projects out on the Babbitt Ranch that go across 10-15 miles east to west, and we certainly want to make sure that there's passage of wildlife there. Thanks.
Can I jump in? May I jump in?
Absolutely not.
Yeah. First, Hannah and Jessica, keep up your energy. You guys are so important. I've been here for over a half a century now, and there's two things that I've observed. You can't really get anything done until you, and these are just comments, we can't really get anything done until you develop that basic culture. And somebody mentioned the lighting ordinance. That's an example of it there. And when it comes to noxious weeds, I've watched that change over the years, and it's really clear that most people don't even know what they are. Sometimes they get mad at them because, oh, that's getting in my way one way or another, whatever it is, but they don't realize what I think I've observed, you know, I haven't written it down and done it in a scientific way, but Flagstaff seems to be the center for noxious weeds moving out in all directions. And it seems to be even more now as we get more and more mechanical means for recreating, of just moving out. Just an example, on off of 180, there's a road 222B. It's one of the roads that used to go out to the recreation area for the winter recreation. And I run out there often, and right at the gate there was a cluster of this used knapweed last year. And I pulled them all out, and they hadn't gone to seed yet or even flowered yet, and put them off in the ditch. And this year, let's see, this was a year ago. Anyways, the cycle of the plant, when I came back for the next cycle, there wasn't any there. So what gives me hope, and if you have that culture and understanding of individuals can do a lot without even any organization. Another example of it is there used to be a lot of the knapweed along Snowball Road, and a lot of people walk Snowball Road. And about 4 or 5 years ago, when they were really prevalent along there, you'd see walkers going along and pulling them out. And if you ran up that road afterwards, you see all these dead knapweeds along the road. And why is that important when you got knapweeds everywhere? Well, as you all know, if it's on the road and it's in seed and it gets in a tire and it gets moved here and it gets moved there, it's the source for spreading. So yeah, my general comment is, again, thank you for working on this, and we just got to develop that culture. And finally, the last thing I jotted down was, Sarah, you mentioned FTI, but there's the Friends of the Forest. There's a whole bunch of individual groups around that are focused on their one little thing. It would be great, and hiking groups and running groups and whatever else, to somehow get this into their minds, that when I'm running or recreating, or when I'm sitting after riding my bike and I see this over there, it's good to either pull it out before it goes to seed or do something about it, just to be aware of it. I just think a lot of people just aren't aware. Anyways,
I think asking the Flagstaff Trails Initiative to start a campaign for invasive weed plogging is a really good idea. You guys know what plogging is? It's when you're jogging, but you're also picking up trash as you go. But I think invasive weed plogging.
well, Sarah,
That's a $1 million idea right there.
Oh, I happen to be on the board, so I'll work on that. Also on the Friends of the Forest. I mean, they're out there all the time, and they have their focus, but all of it can be broadened.
Absolutely. And I think that that's the point, is that many of these groups do want to work across each other, and that Flagstaff has had a culture that lets us have those conversations in a really meaningful way. I think the slide Hannah put up showing the John Wesley Powell corridor that's in the current regional plan, and the wildlife crossings of it is another good example. You know, the city, knowing that we're working on the area plan for that part of the community, went to Game and Fish early and said, what does this look like? What do you know? What can you tell us about this? And Hannah and Jeff Gagnon came back with that data, which showed us a lot, which we have been showing to property owners and saying, what do you think we should do about this? How can we work together to make this less impactful, to think about it differently than maybe just the line on the map that we did when we were only thinking from an engineering perspective, which is where a lot of road construction starts. So just building those relationships, I think, even if we don't have a formal thing to call them, is part of what the plan can help us do more of. I think there's also a question in the chat for Hannah about wildlife crossings across I-40 and what kind of plans there are for those. That wouldn't be a city action, but it would be an action of the federal and state government in our region.
Yeah, so it's actually really exciting. There's finally been some movement on this. You know, I think it was probably 10 years ago when the department did this big analysis of wildlife fatalities along both I-17 and I-40 and identified good locations for wildlife crossings based on those data. And so ADOT's had those plans, sitting on the desk, but of course these crossings are multi-million-dollar projects, each one. And really good news is that the infrastructure bill that was passed last fall by Congress has monies specifically for wildlife linkages and infrastructure for all the states. And because we as a state had already identified these priorities and priority areas for crossings, it's looking like we are going to get money to build at least one of those crossings and hopefully all three. And it's, you never know because it's such a long process, but we're in the beginning planning phases with ADOT to start looking at the scoping and feasibility studies for 3 crossings, I believe. One would be on I-40 north of Garland Prairie, which would potentially connect Pronghorn north and south of I-40, which would be amazing. And then, and as well as other species. And then there's 2 bridges, 2 overpasses potentially on I-17. I think one south of Mountain Air and one in the Munns Park area. So really, really early phases of those, but it's looking like we have quite a bit of funding, multi-million-dollar levels of funding to targeting those overpasses. So that's like, if we can get that done in the next few years, it'll be really a great success.
I think that's a great example of where our long range planning meets an opportunity and is ready. And so we encourage everyone to stay involved in all of these conversations. The snapshots are just a place to get caught up. But we'll keep talking about this as part of the regional plan. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording and let folks continue the conversation for a few minutes if they'd like. Thank you.